Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and the final session of Peter Wolfendale's Reintroduction to Metaphysics 2, Method and Practice. Peter, you can take over.
Right. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm feeling a lot better this week, so hopefully this will go better. Welcome to the fourth and final session of this course, entitled Universal Space and Time. Here's where we sort of get to the punchline. A lot of the issues we've been building up to over the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks now. As I've kind of explained before, what I sort of aim to present here is my own sort of interpretation of Deleuze's theory of universals, which I take to be sort of independently motivated by some of the considerations we've been looking at through the sort of methodology of transcendental realism that I laid out in the first week. So let's kind of recap some of those things a bit before we get into the problem of universals and the particular approach I want to recommend. So, first of all, transcendental realism. There's a variety of ways in which I've characterized this. The really technical definition I gave in the first week is in terms of a sort of asymmetrical sense dependence between the concept of world and the concept of thought. But in terms of how this actually kind of cashes out, it ends up being a certain claim about the relationship between logic and metaphysics, and the importance of empirical discourse in articulating that relationship. There's a few kind of sweeping claims I think this can be kind of condensed down into for our purposes, which are that firstly, the aim of metaphysics is to describe the fundamental structure of reality, or we could just say nature here, insofar as we take the reality in this case to be what is described by the natural sciences, like those things which are engaged in the process of empirical discourse. We could also call it being, but I take those to be sort of interchangeable. Two, that metaphysics is essentially continuous with natural science, even if it can be methodologically distinguished from the vast part of natural science. It's nevertheless continuous with it. Three, although the fundamental structure of nature is unitary, this does not prevent us from distinguishing its different aspects and thus articulating distinct metaphysical problems. So we can see that metaphysics, although it's a single enterprise, nevertheless has different parts that can be split off. We can articulate different distinct metaphysical problems that need to be addressed together in order to come up with a sort of unified metaphysical theory. Four, these aspects are distinguished by examining the logic of our pre-theoretical grasp of the structure of nature. This is what Heidegger would call our pre-ontological understanding of being. And I take it to essentially be our pre-theoretical grasp of the structure of empirical discourse. Right. Pardon me. Turn that off. And five, finally, therefore we understand metaphysical categories in terms of logical categories, and the methodology of metaphysics by way of the architectonic of reason. So the moral of the story kind of painted by these claims is essentially that although there's more to metaphysics than logic, there's an important sense in which logic constrains metaphysics. Metaphysics seeks to understand what nature is, whereas logic seeks to understand what nature means. This extends to the discussion of particular categories and the problems that correspond to them. So, identity, difference, individuality, universality, quantity, quality, relation, essence, space, time, causation. Each of these corresponds to a particular metaphysical problem, but the scope of this problem is determined by the logical analysis of the relevant category in each case. So it's fine to ask the metaphysical question, what is causation? But in order to understand what one is doing in asking that question, you need to ask the question, well, what does causation mean here? What is the logic of the category that we're trying to actually provide a substantive metaphysical interpretation
of? Could you just repeat when you said something and then you said logic seeks what nature means? You said metaphysics X and logic Y. What was the what is it that metaphysics did in that sentence that you said?
So I said metaphysics inquires into what nature is,
right.
Whereas logic in this case inquires into what nature means. And what I mean by that is just say that the logic we're interested in, which as I've kind of explained is restricted to the logic of empirical discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Insofar as that's what we take, well, what I take to be objective in the sense of being absolutely attitude independent, right? What we're interested in is describing the structure of what it is empirical discourse represents by describing the structure of empirical discourse qua representing activity. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
I think so. I was just hung up for a second because when you say the logic of empirical discourse, that made more sense to me, because when you just say logic, then I start to think about, and then in the same sentence is meaning, then I start to think about semantics, and I'm like, but logic, there's like a disjunct there, right, between like the symbolic and the logical, although logic deals with symbols, the manipulation of symbols. Where does the semantic aspect of it, the meaning aspect of it coming from?
Well, I think they're fundamentally continuous. I mean, this is something I talked a little bit about in the first session. I've mentioned it a few times again. I mean, you've got to be careful in using the phrase logic. When I use it just kind of flippantly like this, I just mean the study of the structure of thought. And I think semantics is fundamentally part of that, insofar as semantics aims to understand loosely the structure of the content of thought.
Mm-hmm.
Right. What then do we mean by logic in the more specific sense that, say, formal and philosophical logic are concerned with? Well, fundamentally, it's about the study of inference and the forms of inference, and specifically logical vocabulary. What is that? Well, I take the Brandomian line that what logical vocabulary does is to enable us to make explicit what's already implicit in the content of what we say. So there's a certain sense in which the study of logic is already inherently connected to semantics, insofar as the study of logical vocabulary is the study of the explication of content. Right. Anyway, let's move on.
Yep.
So that's a very kind of simple summary of the transcendental realism position. The previous two sessions were concerned with individuation and modality, an attempt to kind of apply this methodology in going through sort of metaphysical problems regarding these two issues. And so to take the session on individuation first, really what we were concerned with was well, what are objects? But what we mean by this is, well, what are real objects? Right, not just kind of, you know, the sorts of objective thought which are engaged with by fictional discourse and normative discourse and mathematical discourse and all that stuff, but specifically the objects of empirical discourse.
Excuse me, may I? You said real objects, but
yeah.
what is the meaning of the real?
Okay.
I mean, it reminds me Quine's work, Two Dogmas of Empirism, where he said that the first dogma of empirism is there is a difference between analytical judgments and synthetical judgments. And that's why I want to ask you, what is real? How do you divide real objects and other objects?
Well, I mean, this is what the topic of the first lecture was about. Insofar as I take.
Excuse me, I missed it.
It's okay. The notion of real here is actually derived from. So, when I make this distinction between empirical discourse and other kinds of discourse, like fictional discourse and mathematical discourse and normative discourse, the point is that actually the notion of reality that distinguishes real objects is derived from the distinction between these kinds of discourse. Real objects are defined as what empirical discourse concerns itself with. And this is because of the kind of truth that we can say empirical discourse aims at in virtue of its particular structure. And this is what I call objective truth, which is to say, basically, empirical discourse is the only thing that is the only form of discourse which completely gives up its authority over what and the ways in which the objects it talks about are.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, but we were interested in kind of in the second session. It was to try and kind of get deeper into, rather than just kind of, well, what do we mean by object here, right? Trying to get into, well, actually, what are these real objects we're talking about? I've already said that we were specifically concerned with them as the sort of locuses of disagreement with an empirical discourse. But the other things that kind of came up importantly were the question of whether or not real objects should be understood as substances, given that sort of substance metaphysics has been sort of dominant really in history philosophy. And we talked about sort of three ways in which the concept of substance has been understood in terms of sort of three different oppositions: one between thing and stuff, one between body and event, and one between product and process. In each case, sort of substance theory is associated with the prioritization of the first of those: things against stuff, bodies against events, products against processes. And it's basically about finding some kind of primitive category of individuals in terms of which to understand these kinds of derivative accidents, which are nevertheless things that can become objects of discourse in some sense, right? Now, my provisional answer to this again was sort of, well, no, we shouldn't necessarily identify real objects with substances conceived in these ways, but there is something important about this distinction between sort of thing and stuff insofar as there is a kind of important logical distinction underlying the grammatical distinction between sort of count nouns and mass nouns. But we'll come back to that again. So the other two things covered there were we sort of covered this distinction between what I called sort of bare and complex particularity, which is very roughly this distinction between conceptions of individuality which sort individuals via sortal predicates, so like Aristotle and Kant, versus say Leibniz and Locke, who take individuals just to be primitive, not sorted into kinds. But the upshot of this is that this sorting of individuals into different kinds produces like additional logical consequences. So, kind of crucially, for what we'll be talking about today, it means that predicates, and you don't just have sortal predicates, you have sorted predicates, which is to say that predicates end up being associated with particular kinds of individuals to which they can be applied, and they can't be applied to individuals of different kinds. So, very simply, it just as it makes no sense to say that Caesar is identical to the number 9, it's not even false, it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense to say Caesar is a prime number, right? That's a predicate that's appropriate to numbers, but not to people. You can think of all kinds of similar examples, because in fact these sort of issues of predicates being sorted are kind of implicit in our language. We incorporate these into a lot of grammatical distinctions. So just to move back to linguistics very briefly, there's a very classic example comes from Chomsky. The sentence, "Colourless green ideas sleep furiously." Right? It's taken to be a nonsensical sentence that somehow has a kind of grammatical cogency to it. Well, you can see how actually what's going on in us parsing that sentence and finding it to be kind of like nonsensical is that we see that ideas aren't things that can sleep, right? Sleeping isn't something that can be done furiously. We start seeing how there are these kinds of deeper connections between these categories which move beyond sort of surface logic. Anyway, so complex particularity, and the third thing that really brought up was just the idea of conditions of individuation. And again, here I had this kind of fourfold diagram of Leibniz, Locke, Aristotle, and Kant. But the sort of crucial distinction was between Leibniz and Kant, insofar as Leibniz and Kant were really interested in sufficient conditions for individuation. And they had this big debate regarding whether or not space and time are required to individuate things, or whether or not a concept is sufficient. Of course, Leibniz thinks that each thing can have an individual concept, which is sort of infinitely specified, and Kant thinks that we can only ever have these general concepts, which are effectively sortal concepts. But there we are, right? So that was individuation. Some of these themes will turn up again, hopefully. When we were dealing with modality, the question we were really concerned with was, rather than what are real objects, but what are real possibility and probability. We didn't talk about probability as much as I would have liked to, and I'll remedy that a bit later on this session. But roughly that was what we were going at. And again, seeing that the question of how these sort of logical categories get applied get understood as well, interpreted in terms of how they really apply within nature. Again, we had to look to the logic of empirical discourse. And so what we saw there roughly is that the form of modality that we're concerned with is that which is presupposed by counterfactual conditionals, which are essential in articulating causal explanation. Insofar as causal explanation is the sort of meat and drink of empirical discourse, and in fact is presupposed by perceptual justification, which was the sort of crucial hinge for the relationship between empirical discourse and objectivity. Right. On the basis of this, the sort of four things came up. Just to get through this as quickly as possible. On the one hand, firstly, I considered the question of what would be classically called substantial forms. So the relationship between secondary substances and modality in sort of classic Aristotelian substance philosophy. And the thing considered there was basically this idea that the conditions of identity over time supplied by the kind of a thing, which is primary substance in Aristotle, understood as sortals later on, basically implies a certain range of possibilities for that thing. But the problem that emerged was that this range of possibilities, it's implied by these conditions of identity, don't really track questions concerning the causal capacities of the individual. So the different kinds of modality that we're talking about there kind of pull apart. So that was an issue for substance theory. The three things we were concerned with there. First of all, an insight from Kant in his debate against Hume, which was basically this idea that empirical properties, or rather, at least, the empirical predicates that they correspond to, are implicitly modal. You can't grasp the relevant concepts, such as cat, redness, mass, electron, any kind of empirically applicable predicate. You can't grasp the content of them without understanding that their application supports certain counterfactual inferences. Really roughly, you just can't understand what a cat is unless you understand something about what must be the case, what can be the case, and what may be the case if something is a cat. You understand something about the range of variation that the world can undergo, while the truth of your judgments about cats remain the same, without being affected. Okay. Down to 2 points. Rather than the question of bare and complex particularity, what emerged there was a discussion of what I call bare versus complex implication. So, in order to make explicit what was kind of implicit within our empirical concepts, to make explicit these kind of various counterfactually robust connections, we have to use conditionals. We have to be able to make conditional statements about what would happen if. And this is to say, well, we need to be able to use counterfactual conditionals. We talked a bit about the sort of various logical issues regarding the interpretation of standard conditionals and counterfactual conditionals, and how this relates to sort of non-monotonic reasoning. But I think the big thing that came out of it was this idea that that the conditionals that are used in these contexts have to be sort of modally qualified. We end up seeing that in fact there's a variety of different modal operators that can be used to qualify strict and counterfactual conditionals, which correspond to certain ranges of defeasors for non-monotonic inferences that are just kind of excluded. Again, that sounds very technical, but it roughly corresponds, or at least is a parallel of this idea of predicates being sorted. We can't just deal with this like abstract structure of predication. We can't just deal with this abstract structure of implication. We end up having various different sorts of predication and implication, which are dependent on different contextual factors. Right. Finally, as a parallel talking about conditions of individuation, we can talk about conditions of determination. And here, the parallel of discussing sort of the principle of the identity of indiscernibles in Leibniz's discussion of the principle of sufficient reason. And we discussed roughly how you can finesse the principle of sufficient reason, so you don't have to end up as Leibniz or Spinoza. And okay, the final point I want to make is that roughly what came out of these sort of parallels between the issues between weeks 2 and 3, with these sort of concerns with sort of the bare versus complex logic of predication and implication, and these questions of understanding necessary and sufficient conditions of individuation and determination, was a concern with what you might call primitive individuation and primitive determination. So things just being identical and distinct from one another, without there being further reasons for that, such as depending upon additional individuals, or things just being the way they are without there being additional reasons for why one thing happens rather than another. You could call that local underdetermination rather than primitive determination if you wanted. So talk about the sort of parallel between primitive individuation and underdetermination. But the concern here was whether or not it's possible, instead of having to talk about primitive individuation and underdetermination globally, in global terms, whether it's possible to talk about these in local terms. So talk about individuation, or putting it in a kind of Maudelosian turn, just discreteness, whether or not we could think about discreteness as being a local phenomena, and whether and there's a sort of parallel here, whether or not we could think of certain kinds of underdetermination as being local rather than global. Right. That'll make a bit more sense when I come back to talking about probability. But that's the summary done. So, what are we doing this week? Well, we're interested in the problem of universals. Is everybody happy, by the way? Can I move on to universals? Yeah, great. So the problem of universals has a really quite long-standing heritage, going all the way back to Plato. It's so the Platonic theory of ideas is the sort of original theory of universals against which all of the kind of subsequent debates and positions have been judged. And the problem of universals is traditionally just posed as, do universals exist? For example, does the universal doghood exist in an analogous sense to the way in which a particular dog, it's called Fido, exists? So there are various different ways in which you can answer this question, but they all turn precisely on what you mean by existence. So precisely how the analogy between universals and individuals is understood. Now, given the history, the affirmative answers to the question, universals do exist, tend to be grouped under the heading of Platonism, and they basically differ insofar as they provide different accounts of what the sense of doghood exists means. The core issue that each account has to address is the nature of the relationship between the existent universals and its existent instances. So Plato famously locates universals within an independent, intelligible realm. They exist as archetypes that individuals may participate in. So the relationship between the universal and the individuation is classified as participation. Aristotle famously tries to invert this picture by eliminating the intelligible realm in favor of the sensible realm. So universals are supposed to be immanent to the individuals that instantiate them, rather than transcendent. Now, the success of Aristotle's sort of original inversion of Platonism is debatable, but there's another important contribution that Aristotle makes, which we've already kind of discussed a bit, but I just want to kind of keep it up visually because it's useful. And this is that combines the distinction between universal and individual, or singular.
You might need to reorient that board a little bit. I think probably we can't see it.
Is that better?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay. Right. Where's the distinction between substance and accident? I apologise for the shoddy quality of my writing on this board, but I didn't realise until I got it that it kind of wobbles a bit whenever I write on it. So you end up with this slightly wonky writing. But yeah, this basically gets you the distinction between this fourfold distinction between thought qualities. Actually, not universal and singular. Individuals and thoughts. So you can have both universals like doghood, which distinguish between which characterize kinds, and redness, which isn't a kind. It's not something that can be counted. And between sort of individual dogs like Fido and tropes such as Fido's particular shade of redness that only he has. Right. And crucially, this distinction, as we kind of discussed in the second week, is based upon the role that the sortals and qualities play in individuating their instances. Which is to say, basically, sortals can be used to distinguish between things, whereas qualities can't. Or well, rather, qualities can be used to distinguish between things, but not in such a way that enables you to count things. Right. So yeah, it's on this basis that you get the debate between Kant and Leibniz, which I've already discussed, which is to say that essentially Kant thinks, well, Leibniz thinks that, I've already gone over it enough, right? But if you have any questions, ask me, right? Okay. So, returning to the question of whether universals exist, the negative answers are usually grouped under the heading of nominalism. And they differ insofar as they offer different accounts of the sense in which there is a relation between universals and individuals without the former term existing in any sense. We've kind of briefly touched on the relationship between universals and individuation, how sortals are involved within enabling you to count distinct things. But the problem that nominalism is motivated by is a kind of question of individuation one level up, which is the problem of individuating universals themselves. Like, insofar as you treat universals as analogous to individuals, you raise the question of how do you distinguish between them, and how do you identify them? Now, this problem is actually as old as Platonism itself, insofar as it's posed in, at the very least, the Sophist and the Parmenides. It's the issue of how we distinguish between universals so we can determine precisely which universals exist, what features they have, and what relations they stand in to one another. In order that we can stop appealing to non-existent universals, for instance, in the Sophist, the big question is the existence of sophism as an idea, and mischaracterizing those that do exist. So, for instance, misunderstanding the relationship between truth and beauty. Plato and Aristotle give us different accounts of where existent universals are located, in either a distinct intelligible space or somehow in the same space that ordinary individuals are located. Their accounts are unsatisfactory insofar as they fail to provide us with a good account of what you might think of as the meta-sortals we would need to adequately count and thereby differentiate between the various located universals. The common strategy of most nominalists is to overcome the problem of universal individuation by retreating to what you might call the problem of concept individuation. So they treat the problem of universals as one of how we articulate the world into different groups of things, rather than as a problem of how the world is articulated in itself. Now, this strategy produces all sorts of problems, usually epistemological problems regarding how we're supposed to judge whether or not the way in which we articulate the world is any good. Like, how you judge between different ways of cutting reality up. If there is no such thing as the way reality is cut at the joints itself. I'm not going to address these in any real detail. For those of you who are interested in sort of Sellers and post-Salesian philosophy, this is where I really kind of part ways from Sellers, insofar as Sellers is very hardcore nominalist, very interesting nominalist, by the way, if you're interested in looking at sort of very interesting modern day nominalism. But ultimately, I just think nominalist in an unnecessary way. Instead, I just briefly address the nominalist aspect of Delander's interpretation of Deleuze, because this is something I disagree with Delander quite heavily on, and it's sort of the crux of my interpretation.
So, I'm sorry, Delander, you consider him a nominalist, or at least his interpretation of Deleuze, is that Deleuze is a nominalist? Both?
Delander's very explicit about it.
Okay.
I mean, there are nuances here, right? So what Delander's position is, this is what he calls flat ontology. And the idea is essentially that all you have is individuals. You don't have species or genuses to which individuals belong. This is best demonstrated with the way in which he thinks it works in biology. So he thinks that there is no such thing as the species of lion other than the actual population of lions. Now, he thinks that population isn't just like a set of lions. It's not like, oh, I just think that the universal lion should be understood in terms of like the set of actually existing lions. No, he thinks that this is like a higher level process, a population dynamic, which continually produces new lions and continues to evolve over time, and potentially will split into divergent species or whatever. But nevertheless, that higher level population dynamic process is itself an individual. It's not of a different special category. This is kind of nuanced a little bit in Delander, insofar as he does think there are what he calls universal singularities. So he thinks that there are sort of common features which are actualized in different kind of biological strata. So, for instance, like I think the example he would pick would be something like the what's it called? The four-limb body form is a particular name for it. But he thinks of kind of like the abstract pattern of like the four-limb body form, or maybe like the insectoid body form, is no longer being like understandable as anything like something intrinsic to a given population dynamic, but rather some kind of abstract form that is realized in various different ways, similar to the way in which, say, the Feigenbaum number turns up both in sort of patterning turbulence and in patterning kind of period doubling cascades in stock market bubbles. Right? There are these kind of abstract mathematical forms that somehow appear in different areas. But the problem you really have with Delander's picture is how you connect up these kind of two levels of generality. One is kind of this idea of sort of very abstract mathematical forms just popping up in different areas. And on the other hand, more kind of concrete forms of generality just being understood as being higher level individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So the example I usually give in kind of demonstrating the issue is prostitution, because it's a good example of a pattern that repeatedly turns up in human civilization. Like wherever, prostitution independently starts in human cultures across history, right? And it has certain very common dynamics that you can study, right? But those common dynamics don't emerge from anything like a single population of prostitutes that is reproducing itself across time. So it's not like the lion case. You can't say, well, what's common to lions comes from this single abstract process that is reproducing lions, right? It's not what's happening in prostitutes, right? But at the same time, you don't want to say, well, okay, well, but the abstract general patterns that we're seeing within prostitution in various different communities across different geographies and history are what's another example? Energy minimizing attractors that are kind of common between different physical phenomena. Like he uses the example of a soap bubble and a crystal. Insofar as crystallization and soap bubble formation are both a kind of minimal energy state. That kind of abstract physical principle isn't what's going on in the case of prostitution. There's some kind of dependence of prostitution upon very specific kind of material structures of humanity. But on the other hand, it's not dependent in such a way as to require temporal continuity across different sort of reproductive processes. Anyway, so Delander's theory of universals is sort of interesting, but yeah, I think it isn't sufficient. But it's a kind of different take on nominalism, which is worth looking at least. Okay. Right. Okay. Interestingly enough, just to kind of say why it's an important different take on nominalism is it's a kind of nominalism that doesn't retreat to the question of conceptual individuation. So for Delander, he's very much like the world is articulated the way it is. It's got nothing to do with the way in which we create sort of conceptual schemes to cut it up. Right? That's not Delander's interesting. Right. So
I have so many questions. I'm going to put them on hold. But you said flat ontology, and I'm wondering, is that related to object-oriented philosophy? Because they're often referred to as flat ontologies as well. And what's the connection there with nominalism? And so yeah.
I talked about this in the first course. Basically, it's just it's a terminological clusterfuck.
Yeah.
Where the term flat ontology originates with Roy Bhaskar, who uses it to mean something which he takes to be negative, right? Delander then uses it and appropriates it to mean something positive, but it's actually quite different from what Bhaskar was talking about, right? But at least in Delander it's very well defined. It's basically look, there are no universals, there are just individuals, but there are individuals at different spatio-temporal scales. So, individual lions, they're individuals, but also the population of lions, that's an individual too, right? This gets kind of picked up in different ways by Levi Bryant and Graham Harman, and then just put through the mill and just turned into this kind of metaphor for, well, everything's an object, right? Which has no relation to what Delander's talking about or Bhaskar's talking about. Okay. So it's certainly got nothing to do with nominalism. So just it. Personally, I think when it gets into object orientology, it's a completely useless term.
Okay.
Completely useless.
Got it.
But yeah, read the book if you're interested.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So that's the sort of historical perspective on Platonism versus nominalism. Let's methodological perspective I've been building on. So, what's the kind of corresponding question? So we talked about, well, what are real objects, or what are objects really? What is real possibility and probability, or what are possibility and probability really, right? Well, the corresponding question here is, well, what are real properties, or what are properties really, right? And fundamentally, from a logical perspective, the thing that correspond to properties are predicates, right? But we've got to make some sort of additional distinctions in order to get down to what we're interested in. So, just for those of you who don't have much of a logical background, like a predicate, from a just kind of formal logic syntactical perspective, is just something that you can attach to an object. But at the same time, that's something that can be quantified over by being attached to a quantifier and a variable rather than a constant predicting. So you can say, both that A is P or that for all x, x is P. Right? Way of seeing this more in natural languages in terms of open sentences. So do something like that. He's red. Or is a dog. Right? It's an open sentence into which you need to slot a singular term referring to an object in order to get something that was meaningful. That could be true or false. Right? But from this kind of sort of abstract perspective, you can cook up all kinds of weird predicates. Right? You can cook up like let's say is a dog and likes cheese. Right? That from a grammatical, it's a perfectly fine predicate, right? Is red or purple? Seems like a perfectly fine predicate. And you equally have predicates which take, so say, we could have a predicate like is in love with Jeff. Seems perfectly okay. But then we could decide to take out Jeff, and then we'd have a two-place predicate. So something is in love with something else, right? The notion of predicate is a very flexible one. So you want to start making distinctions in it in order to try and think about how it gets you a grip on the notion of a property. So sort of the three distinctions that are worthwhile are monadic versus relational. So monadic predicate is just a predicate that takes only one argument, just applies to one thing, right? Relational predicate, it's a relation like, someone loves someone else, right? Two-place predicate, right? X is between Y and Z, three-place predicate, right? Very straightforward. And then have a distinction between simple and complex predicates. Predicates like I put up there is red or purple. Right? That's a predicate that involves logical vocabulary. Right? So you could just abstract away from that in simple terms and just say like property of being red or purple is FA, right? We'll just abstract away from its internal structure, right? But you can also kind of incorporate that structure into the notation. So you could say something is, well, let's use more representative letters, red or purple, red and red or purple, right? And that is a perfectly good complex predicate if you just oh crap, can't see. That's perfectly good complex predicate if you just take the variables to be unbound. So you say like the same variables in each case, like whatever you're talking about, if you apply this predicate to it, it's either red or purple. Basically, you can construct complex predicates however you like out of simple predicates and logical vocabulary like and or not, implication, sorry, conditionals, whatever you want. Finally, distinction we've already kind of gone on quite a bit: sortal versus non-sortal. Okay. These are a kind of logical or more kind of syntactic syntactical distinction. Thinking about properties, right? Properties as opposed to relations are always going to correspond to monadic predicates rather than to relational predicates. Properties, you're always going to be interested in things that can only take one argument. But then there's certain additional distinctions that you might want to make, which relate to these more syntactical distinctions in an interesting way. I've got to kind of judge how much I can fit on the board here, but sparse versus abundant. You can just about see that. Okay. So, the distinction between sparse and abundant properties is something which gets debated quite a bit in analytic metaphysics. Roughly, the idea is whether for every predicate you can cook up, there's a corresponding property. For every monadic predicate you can cook up, is there a corresponding property? So, this is kind of roughly parallel to some of Plato's issues with regard to whether, for instance, there's a form of mud. Is there an idea of mud, or is there just an idea of water and dirt? Right. In its modern guise, this ends up taking the form of, well, look, we can construct a predicate arbitrarily for pretty much any given set of entities you want to name. You know, my left shoe, the sun, you know, all of the popcorn on the east coast of America. Like, you can put whatever you want in them, right? Is there a property of being in that set, right? Under a kind of an abundant account of properties, basically there's no important difference between belonging to an arbitrary set or having some kind of arbitrary combination of properties that we can, you know, specify willy-nilly, and things that we take to be more important, usually like mass, charge, spin, trying to think of useful non-physics properties, but we'll leave it at just the physics ones for now. Interestingly enough, this starts introducing issues to do with simple versus complex predicates. So we can kind of see that once we're trying to think about properties rather than merely predicates, we're generally definitely going to be concerned with more monadic ones. But if what we're interested in is trying to give a sparse account of properties in which we try and distinguish what we take to be these sort of like important, what corresponds to important and explanatorily useful predicates, as opposed to sort of trivial ones that we can arbitrarily construct in a linguistic fashion, then we're going to be interested in this distinction between simple and complex predicates, because precisely complex predicates are those that we can just arbitrarily construct. You know, we can talk about the property of being red or blue, right? Is that a property, or is it simply that being red is a property, or being blue is a property, but not you can't have like a disjunctive property for two. So it's not just sets; it's also questions to do with logical complexity. Here, empirical versus non-empirical properties. This is one of the issues that we kind of opened up with in week one, insofar as one of the sort of debates I was really interested in is this debate between McDowell and Simon Blackburn over whether or not things really have value properties, like whether or not the sunset just is beautiful in the same sense in which it's caused by, you know, photons being diffracted through the atmosphere from a giant fusing ball of hydrogen. Obviously, from my perspective, insofar as we're interested in the logic of empirical discourse, what we're concerned with is empirical properties versus non-empirical ones like value. Finally, I just thought I'd throw in this distinction between quality and quantity. You know, you can distinguish between qualities. Classic examples as ever: color versus quantities. You know, temperature. Well, that's an intensive quantity rather than an extensive quantity. You can also talk about size, weight, all sorts of things. That'll come in useful there. The thing which is useful about focusing on empirical properties for getting a grip on everything else that's going on here in terms of the relations between properties and predicates, is that we can try and understand what constitutes a a real empirical property in terms of, pardon me, in terms of conceptual revision. So if you remember, the possibility of conceptual revision is a crucial feature of what makes empirical discourse objective. This gives you a reason for talking about why, rather than okay. Let's put it in different terms. I think it's easy to get an intuitive grip on why, from a metaphysical perspective, what we want is a theory of, in developing a theory of real properties, what we want is a theory of sparse properties. What we want is a theory of those universals that are actually playing a role in structuring the world, that are sort of indispensable that are indispensable in describing and understanding how that world works. Conceptual revision, or the role of conceptual revision here, gives us a way of getting purchase upon that intuition and explaining it, rather justifying it. I think there's two real issues. One is essentially that simple predicates simple predicates are indexes of revision. So, crucially, our concept of electron, right, has changed quite a lot over the course of the 20th century, right? How is it that we can take ourselves to be talking about the same thing now as what Rutherford was talking about in the early 20th century? How is that we can see this as being an actual revision of the concept of electron, an attempt to get a better grasp on the same property, right, of being an electron, right? Rather than simply thinking that, well, look, we've just got a new concept, right, and thus we're cutting up the world in a completely different way, and so there's no continuity between that. Crucially, in order to have this kind of index of revision, this idea of continuity despite changes in the concept, you need to have simple predicates. And this sort of simplistic way of showing this, and I probably shouldn't go into it in too much detail, but the simplistic way of showing this goes back to the acid example I talked about in the second week. So Brandom has this really toy example of concept revision, whereby he defines the concept of acid as having a circumstance of application and a consequence of application. Circumstance of application is If something tastes sour, then it's an acid. Consequence of application: if something is an acid, it turns litmus paper red. Right? His idea is it's a toy concept, but if you come across something in the world that tastes sour but turns litmus paper blue, it forces you to revise that concept. You can't keep it. The crucial thing here is that distinction between circumstances of application and consequences of application can't be collapsed into a conjunction. So you can't say, well, an acid is just something that tastes sour and turns litmus paper blue. Turns litmus paper red, sorry. If you collapse that into a conjunction, right, then if you come across something in the world that tastes sour and turns litmus paper blue, you just have come across something that doesn't fall under that concept, right? That complex predicate doesn't apply to it, right? But it therefore doesn't force you to actually revise your concept and attempt to incorporate certain important connections between things. Like you're in that like toy concept of acid, you're trying to capture some sort of law-like connection between these two things, right? If you just specify the concept in terms of a brute conjunction, you don't capture that, and so you can't be forced to revise your concept. So crucially, we need simple rather than complex predicates, because the actual sort of underlying commitments that go into constituting those concepts need to be able to revise while the predicate counts as the same. Right? If the predicate wears its sort of internal structure on its sleeve, then automatically it changes. Two, and I've kind of already said this to some extent, but it's important to get it explicitly, which is that sparse properties capture modal structure. Okay. So the point of the concept of electron is it's trying to capture certain modal features of reality. It's trying to capture certain law-like relations between particles, which end up having macro-scale effects. Although the theories of electron can change and be revised, the terms in which they're articulated differ, and the particular laws change. There's a sense in which, when the theories are revised, they nevertheless incorporate the structure of the previous ones. So, if we were to talk about the concept of mass, right? The concept of mass changes between Newtonian and Einsteinian Newtonian mechanics and Einsteinian relativity. But fundamentally, Einsteinian relativity aims to capture all of the sort of interesting modal structure that Newtonian mechanics could describe about mass, acceleration, and gravity and the like, but now treats it as a kind of limit case of a more broader space of possibility and variation that I can consider. Crucially, if you think of the examples of sort of abundant properties that we talked about, like, you know, belonging to the set of, you know, my left shoe, the sun, popcorn, all of that. The crucial thing is belonging to that set has no interesting explanatory consequences. There's no interesting modal structure you're getting a grip on there. There's no belonging to that set says absolutely nothing about what can, must, or may happen to you. So the idea that we took from sort of Kant, but it also comes through Sellers and Random, that sort of properties are intrinsically modal, ends up forcing us into some understanding of real properties as being completely distinct from arbitrarily constructed, or properties that you would take to correspond to arbitrarily constructed predicates because of their explanatory differences. Okay, I hope that made some sense. Right. As ever, I'm too slow. So, right. I want to say something about probability, and then we'll move directly into universals. Okay. Deleuze's theory of universals. So, I didn't really talk about probability last week, but I wanted to. The crucial thing about probability is that you can't really talk about a property unless you talk about possibility. It's dependent upon possibility. Okay. I'm just going to read some stuff, so it'll make sense. So, the mathematical understanding of probability has always been linked to the history of games. This is because games offer idealized sets of rules which determine fixed sets of possible states between which the total sum of all probabilities, the number 1, which is the correlate of certainty, can be divided. This is most obvious in games of chance, for instance, where a die has 6 possible and roughly equally probable outcomes, dividing certainty 6 ways. So the chance of the die turning up on either side is a 6th, right? However, we can imagine games that are not immediately based on chance, such as chess, wherein there is a certain fixed number of possible moves for either side, and as such a fixed number of possible second moves, etc., creating a space of all possible games within which only certain possible states can follow from certain others. Here, the probability of a given state is not determined purely on the basis of the distribution of possible states, but also on the player's skill in choosing between moves. Nevertheless, the rules prevent the players from deviating from the fixed distribution of possibilities, say by moving a rook diagonally or shooting the other player through the chest. In all such games, chance only enters at predetermined points, and at these points finite sets of possible states branch out, between which probabilities or shares of chance are apportioned. So, a game of dice may involve 3 distinct throws, with the probability of the overall result as a function of the probabilities of each taken separately. But this always excludes outside chances, which interfere with the ideal distribution at the points between throws. The understanding of any system on the basis of probability involves this kind of idealization, through which it's broken down into strict causal regularities, providing the necessity providing the necessity of the transitions between the fixed points of chance and the eruptions of contingency which these chances represent. Once these points are isolated, the total set of possible outcomes is delimited as the product of the set of outcomes of each fixed point of decision. So the real measure of probability is introduced by the constraints placed upon these fixed points, understood as extrinsic to the possibilities themselves. In reality, the die as a whole is constituted by billions of molecules, each with its own motion and its own possibilities, all feeding back into the whole. At each moment, all of the interactions of the die with the molecules of air and each bump on the rough surface of the table upon which it's rolled introduce contingencies into the throw. Of course, it's correct to say that no system at all can be modelled on the basis of the totality of such constraints. If chance were to be introduced at every point, there would be no calculation of probability, because there could not even be the delimitation of the set of possible outcomes. If you had to model each individual atom of the die in order to model the space of probability, it would just be completely intractable. As such, probabilistic models of phenomena always involve restrictions of the relevant factors and estimations of their effects on interactions. So we must give our dice a determinate number of sides, and even though we may weight these sides to different extents by reapportioning chance between outcomes as we see fit. So for instance, sort of after a while of having rolled the same dice, seeing that 6 turns up more often than not, we could reject and decide to increase the probability of 6 in our model. Right? This is always a rejection of the actual statistics, right? Rather than any kind of modeling of what you might want to think of as any kind of intrinsic tendency. Now, the metaphysical debate regarding the nature of probability tends to focus upon whether or not it is reducible to our ignorance of the totality of causal constraints, or whether there's something like real chance over and above this ignorance. The core issue here is the question of whether every determinate state has a sufficient reason. If one accepts the principle of sufficient reason, then it's much easier to maintain that chance is purely epistemic, even if it is based upon an ignorance that only infinite intellect could overcome. So Spinoza or Leibniz is God. But this threatens to collapse into and undermine the metaphysics of possibility on which it's founded. Once one acknowledges that there is a reason why the actual world is in one state rather than another, it becomes hard to defend the thesis that possible states are any more real than probable ones. This is the fine line across which Spinoza and Hume stare at one another. If one denies the principle of sufficient reason, then it is much easier to maintain that chance is properly metaphysical, even if it is something extrinsic to possible states that selects which ones to actualize. But this threatens to collapse the various local points of chance into a single global chaos, which determines everything. Right? So, you end up in considering the question of the reality of probability, torn between two obvious positions. One being that probability isn't real, it's just epistemic. It's simply a matter of our ignorance of the totality of causal factors that go into determining the actual world and the way it is. On the other hand, you get taken towards a position in which, if probability is real, it's because there are some things which are undetermined by the series of causal factors that constitute the world. and thus we have to introduce some kind of metaphysical supplement, some kind of eruption of contingency, like the actual moments of throwing the dice within the game. But if you do that, these have a tendency to kind of collapse back into a single metaphysical ground, a kind of theology of contingency, which is precisely what you get with Measu, where fundamentally he rejects sufficient reason, but the rejection of sufficient reason amounts to, well, there is this hyper chaos which comes in and just changes things for no reason whatsoever. It acts as a kind of transcendent supplement. The real question is whether there is a metaphysical position that you can occupy between these two. I mean, if given the choice, I'd take, brute determinism. There is just no reality of probability at all over Measu's hyperchaos. But you want to see if there's a more nuanced position you can occupy in between, in which there is such a thing as a reality of probability, independent of ignorance. And I think Deleuze's critique of possibility and probability, as they are ordinarily understood, is useful insofar as it kind of sets up desiderata for this positive metaphysical alternative. So, what are Deleuze's problems with possibility and the theory of probability on which it's based? The theory of probability that's based upon. These are basically two issues. First of all, that the possible essentially resembles the actual. Deleuze basically sees that when we talk about possible states, in essence, they are identical to actual states, simply with their actuality removed. They are like actual states that aren't actual, that haven't been realized. Right? And moreover, they're usually constituted through this process of retrojecting the actual in a kind of combinatorial way. We look at the way things are and we recombine it in different ways to project ways in which things could have been. Right? But these are kind of completely individuated, alternative actual states of affairs. Deleuze's second problem with this is that the possible is indifferent to its actualization. So when you the game of dice, you work out its kind of the total space of possibility. Right? Either it's going to be one of these 6 options, or if we have another, it's going to be one of 36, or whatever. That total set of possibilities is indifferent to which one of them is actualized. And this is essentially the idea that probability is entirely extrinsic to the possible states out of which an actual state is realized. So what Deleuze wants to put forward in his account of the virtual as opposed to the possible is going to be an account of potentiality that doesn't resemble the actual. It allows for potential different actualizations, but it doesn't resemble those actualizations. And 2, which, although it allows for potential different actualizations, isn't indifferent to which possible route is actualized. Okay. And Deleuze's theory of the virtual and his theory of universals are essentially the same thing. So, right. Moving on to Deleuze's theory of universals. Wait a minute. Sorry, just looking at the question that Josh has posed. I think the answer is sort of yes and no, but let's get further into it, if that's okay. Okay, so right. What's the core insight of Deleuze's theory of universals? As far as I'm concerned, it's that universals shouldn't be understood by an analogy with individuals. So we shouldn't think about real properties as things that exist like individuals exist. Right? We should rather think of them as conditions of individuation comparable to space and time. And again, much in the way in which Kant takes space and time to be conditions for individuating things within experience. Right. Pardon me, my phone is going off. It stopped. Fine, great. Right. In order to explain this, I'm going to go back to Leibniz. Okay. So, as I discussed in the second lecture, there's sort of fundamentally two different kinds of spatial individuation. There's occupying a location in space, which enables you to distinguish between two things that fall under the same general concept. Right? The two identical black spheres are different because one of them's in this location, one of them's in this location, right? But there's also being a location in space. Right? The actual spatial points themselves are distinct from one another, right? In virtue of being the locations that they are. The best way to demonstrate the latter kind of individuation is to look at a kind of primordial example, not from empirical discourse, but from mathematical discourse, the natural numbers. So there's an infinite series of perfectly distinct natural numbers, right? And they stand in precise relations of succession to one another, right? And that tails off into infinity. 1 is the successor of 0, 2 is the successor of 1, 3 is the successor of 2, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Right? The crucial thing to see is that numbers don't occupy points along the line of succession, as if their mathematical properties could somehow be pulled apart from their location. They simply are points along the line of succession and nothing more. The link between their properties and their location is purely necessary. By contrast, we normally think of physical objects as standing in contingent relations of occupation with their location, and that they have at least some properties that are not dependent upon their location. Leibniz's ambition in his principle of identity of indiscernibles is encapsulated by the idea that he thinks the subjects of their propositions, which he just calls monads, these bare individuals, individuated in precisely the same way that numbers are. that this may be done without appeal to either space or time as they are traditionally understood. The best way to show this the best way to demonstrate this is by showing how it is possible to graph the propositions expressing the properties individuals possess, and showing how Leibniz transforms this into a qualitative space capable of individuating monads. So we'll draw two quick diagrams and show how one transforms into the other. And crucially, because of what I was saying earlier about Leibniz's penchant for what I've called bare particularity, all we're dealing with is simple monadic predicates. No relations, no complex predicates. Right? If we create a graph in which we try and list all of the individuals that there are down one side, and all of the predicates that there are down the other, so we get FA, GA, J, B, GB, HB, etc. Right? If this graph generally contains all possible individuals and all possible predicates, then what we get is a graph of all possible propositions. Right? What we might call a propositional manifold. Such manifolds are the spaces that traditionally condition our individuation of actual states of affairs by delimiting all possible states of affairs. Right? This is a very kind of abstract notion of possibility, just understood combinatorially. Right? So we treat these propositions as locations or possibilities that can be occupied or actualized insofar as it is contingent whether they are true or false. This information can be incorporated into the manifold itself by transforming it into a surface that curves through a binary dimension of truth and falsity. So if you think of this manifold stretching off into infinity as a space, you can think of that space as then curving through an additional dimension. Just imagine that dimension is just 0 and 1, true or false. Then what you have is sort of that's true, that's false. Right? That curvature of that surface encodes everything you could know about the actual world. It gives you a set of propositions that are true at the actual world. So it, in a certain sense, gives all of the information that you could have about the actual world. And it's also can be completely digitally encoded, insofar as all you need to do is, for each box, give a 0 or 1. And that gives you a complete sort of, if you go like that way, it would give you a complete digital encoding of everything that's true in the world, all the information about the actual world. And what Leibniz does is to transform this propositional manifold into what you might think of as a qualitative manifold. So instead of thinking of this as, instead of having pre-individuated individuals and the predicates that they might have, think of dimensions as corresponding predicates. So let's say we've got a world in which we just have two predicates, f and g. Right? Then each of these locations within the space corresponds to an individual. So let's say A, B, C, and D. Right? That individual is entirely individuated by its location within the space. Leibniz's spatiotemporal epiphenomenalism, the idea that basically space and time are completely irrelevant for individuating things, boils down to the idea that each location in such a manifold, which just corresponds to a series of predicates, right, completely individuates a given possible monad. So these are possible individuals, right? The difference between the diagram and what Leibniz thinks is that he takes the number of predicates to be infinite. So he thinks that rather than simply having two dimensions here, we have infinite dimensions going along for the infinity of predicates that there are. This means that each point within that infinite dimensional space is a monad, right? And a possible world is just a set of those points, right? Well, it's a set of those points which are compossible with one another. We'll leave compossibility. This means that the actual world is just a surface composed out of this infinite dimensional space by, again, curving it through a binary dimension. This curvature selects one set of compossible points as the set which is actualized. So you think that like A might be actual and B might be actual, but B and C are just possible. Though again, that's very crude because it's just two dimensions rather than infinite dimension. Does that make any sense to people? This idea that basically for Leibniz, what he's done is to make the individuation of monads like the individuation of numbers. Like just as numbers just are points on the line of succession, possible monads just are points within the space of predicates, right? And then the actual world is just a particular set of points within that space, like a surface that curves through it. Okay, right. Now, okay. Now, what Deleuze realizes, essentially, is that this way of understanding the actual world in graph form can be pulled apart from understanding it in propositional terms. So the procedure for graphing propositional information makes it very clear that it's convertible into digital information. Right? The propositional manifold I put forward before can be just converted into a series of zeros and ones, even if it's an infinite series. Right? Following Bergson, Deleuze is very aware that there are forms of analog information that can't be convertible in this way. So our linguistic ability to represent the actual world using propositions has been exceeded by our mathematical ability to model it using graphs and using analysis and all of these kind of mathematical tools. This is what motivates Deleuze to develop a metaphysics of the sub-representation. The principal consequence of this shift in perspective is that Deleuze allows for more than just binary qualitative dimensions. Whereas in Leibniz, each predicate just corresponds to a dimension which is yes or no, F or not F, right? G or not G, red or not red. Deleuze allows was to incorporate all of the myriad qualities and quantities that would be used in the most outlandish graphs we could possibly dream up. So this gives the qualitative space a much more interesting structure. And insofar as it allows the incorporation of continuous variation in quality and quantity, it escapes the possibility of lossless conversion into digital information. The other consequence of this is that Deleuze breaks with Leibniz in rejecting his epiphenomenalism. So Deleuze takes seriously the progress that the sciences have made in modeling the world using these mathematical techniques, and the fact that these models deploy space and time in complex ways from which it is impossible to separate the quantities and qualities they deal with. So you just can't get away if you want to actually deal with the ways in which science captures information about the world in graph form, dealing with space, time, speeds, velocities. You have to allow these additional dimensions in. Okay. So this gives us an outline of Deleuze's strategy in dealing with the problem of universals. Universals are constituted by the dimensions through which the actual world curves, qua informational surface. So instead of thinking of the actual world as informationally encapsulated by this sort of propositional manifold, we think of it I'll do that. I'll just read the same section again. Sorry. So, Deleuze's strategy in dealing with the problem of universals is to treat universals as constituted by the dimensions through which the actual world curves qua informational surface. So, when Deleuze says that the idea of fire is present whenever there is fire, he's actually being quite serious. At this location, the world expresses the complex mix of qualitative and quantitative determinations constitutive of fire, insofar as the surface of the actual world curves through the appropriate dimensions. It ends up being more complicated than this, but this is the most sort of evocative way of putting it. Don't think of universals as things, think of them as dimensions or complexes of dimensions through which the information about the actual world can actually be encoded. Right? However, this doesn't make proper sense unless you can understand Deleuze's theory of the virtual. How he reconceives of the possible. Right, so the virtual fundamentally has sort of two dimensions. It's meant to account for both the inherent capacities of things, such as Spinoza's account of sort of intrinsic modality that we talked about last week, but also the tendencies of things that our talk of possibilities and probabilities attempts to grasp. So the notion of possibility is supposed to be kind of captured in a notion of capacity, and the notion of probability is meant to be captured in a notion of real tendency. The innovation that's supposed to do this, without understanding virtual states by analogy with our rejective ways of representing them through recombining propositions about actual states. Oh crap. So the innovation is that the account of the virtual is supposed to do this, but never mind. Okay. Fundamentally, Deleuze wants an account of the virtual which captures the capacities and tendencies of things, that is immanent to the actual, insofar as it doesn't require any transcendent supplement to actualize itself. It's not indifferent to which possible state or virtual state is actualized. Okay. Right. This is the point at which I'm going to get into the reading, because basically Deleuze's theory of the virtual is taken from his reading of dynamic systems theory. I know I put this reading up a bit too late, and I apologize for those who haven't had the chance to read it. But I'll kind of very briefly go through this. So Deleuze draws his theory of the virtual from the structure of dynamic systems theory, which is the principal tool used by the sciences to extract information about the tendencies of individual systems from graphs of their actual states. It's this which this is what enables him to convert Leibniz's theory of monads into his own theory of what he calls nomads. It's important to understand this, that dynamic systems theory does this by taking a graph of the actual history of a system and collapsing the time dimension. It uses a series of complex mathematical techniques to retain relevant information about how the various variables the different dimensions represent tend to interact with one another, while losing the irrelevant information about how they actually interact in particular cases. So the simplest example I've got of this is a pendulum. So take the actual graph of the pendulum. Right, positive and negative, 0. Now imagine that, this axis is playing two roles. It's playing the role both of position and velocity. So let's just separate out the two trajectories. So one of these is position and one is velocity. Right? That shows you the actual state of the pendulum at any given point over time. This is your time dimension. Position and velocity are both being represented in the same thing. If you take away the time dimension, what you get is a phase space. You've got position here and velocity here, right? Zero and 0. And what you end up with is what's called an attractor. So what you get here is a surface with one less dimension than the initial graph, right? Whose curvature, so this is actually a curved surface, right? Nevertheless describes the tendencies of the system in form of the differential relations between the variables that draw it. The topologically significant features of the surface are called attractors. So although this is drawn as kind of a line here, really what this is representing is a topological feature of the curvature of the surface. So a way of visualizing this is to think of it as like a moat. So think of like a surface you've got that curves such that, and what it basically means is that wherever you start the system, because any of these points here is a possible state that the system could be in. Wherever you start it, the system will tend towards its attractor, and then carry on around. So by collapsing the time dimension and extract, well, what has been done is to kind of extract this information about how the system has actually behaved, and turn it into a model of how it tends to behave under a variety of different conditions. Now, if you did the reading, the more complicated example, which is given in there, is this example of a predator-prey system between either fish or foxes and rabbits. And you get a similar kind of example where basically you've got a number of foxes, number of rabbits. The idea is wherever you start within that space, at least within what's called the basin of attraction, right? A system will tend to this sort of steady state, well, not periodic state, in which foxes will overconsume, rabbit population will drop, which means the fox population drops, which means the rabbit population booms, which means the fox population booms. You get this kind of cyclical pattern, which is roughly captured by that tendency. The crucial thing is that as opposed to the model of retrojective probabilities we talked about in the game example, here the tendencies are immanent to the system. And a sort of crucial way to demonstrate that is to take an even simpler example. So imagine a bowl with a marble in it. This kind of almost represents its own phase space, right? Because under gravity, right, assuming you've got the ball kind of face up, what you'll end up with is a single point attractor. Wherever you start the marble in the ball, it'll move around a bit, but it'll tend towards the single point at the bottom, right? And you can map this as a phase space, which basically is just looks like a ball. However, imagine shaking the ball. Here what you have is a kind of external shock to the system that isn't captured within it. Like I, as the person shaking it, I'm not kind of represented on any point in the axes or whatever, right? But nevertheless, the way in which the ball will tend to respond to kind of random external output is captured by the phase space, right? Similarly, although, so put it in a better way, right? Take the fox-rabbit system, right? Population of foxes and rabbits in the wild, right? All we're tracking here is the relationship between the number of foxes and the number of rabbits, and the way they interact. We are not tracking things like hunting parties coming in and killing a number of foxes, right? We are not counting those within our space of possibility, right? Whereas if we were to to try and model them from a standard probabilistic perspective, we'd have to include those possible states within our model. Nevertheless, despite the fact that those possibilities have not been incorporated, we can still see how the system will tend to operate under those conditions. Because if, you know, a bunch of fox hunters ride into the environment that we're monitoring and kill a whole bunch of foxes, right, they will move the system away from the attractor, right? But the system will still tend back towards it. Right? It gives us a grip upon the unlikeliness of the system being in any of these other states than this, which is nevertheless independent of any grasp of the totality of possible occurrences. I don't know if I explained that very well. Does that make at least partial sense to people? Okay, right. Okay. Right. The next thing to say then is just that, as opposed to Leibniz's monads, what Deleuze calls the nomad is a point embedded on this surface. So if you think of this virtual multiplicity as being a surface whose curvature encodes information about the tendencies of the system, the way the system will tend to behave, and also ways it can't be. Like if the system moves out of the basin of attraction, it will dissipate. Like if you kill everything except one rabbit, right, the foxes are probably going to get it, and that's going to be the end of that ecosystem, at least as it stands, right? You can think of the state of the ecosystem as it currently is as being a point on this surface. This is kind of what I've been doing, is I've been saying, look, think of the system as it currently is as being, it's in that state there, that point within the possibility space. Then what does it do, right? But what it does is to move around, to draw, or probably more like that, to draw an actual trajectory. But it's important, despite the fact that this is just a line and this is just a line, to understand that the actual trajectory and the attractor, or what Deleuze would call a singularity, aren't the same thing. One is a topological invariant of the surface. The other is a line, or rather just a moving point embedded on that surface, drawing a line. Okay. Okay. Right. The crucial thing I want to point out here is that what we have here is something like an abstract universal. What I mean by that is it's abstract because it doesn't yet individuate all of its instances. So I hate the fact that my drawings are so awful, but imagine that you've got a whole bunch of different fox-rabbit systems all over the universe, right? Or better, a whole bunch of different pendulums, right? You can see all of those individual systems as if they were points on the same surface, right? This surface describes their tendencies from the perspective of how just two variables of the system interact, right? But crucially, they aren't individuated by this completely, because it's entirely possible for two systems to be in the same state, for 2 points to coexist in the same location on the surface, right? And so they're not individuated by their location. Fair enough. We'll get round to thinking about how we solve that shortly. First of all, I just want to say something about how this relates to some of the issues I mentioned earlier. So, first of all, sortals versus sorted predicates. This is something that I've been going on about since week 2, right? Well, what we have here is, if it's an abstract universal, it's something like a sortal. It distinguishes a kind of system, right? The points within that space, even if they can overlap or whatever, right, are individuals, right? They're individual pendulum systems or individual population dynamic systems. You know, this is just like a sortal concept, or it plays the role of a sortal concept that should theoretically enable you to count these different systems. See how many points are traversing the space. But on the other hand, at the same time, it it indicates, or it kind of demonstrates the real basis of the connection between sortal predicates and sorted predicates, predicates that are only applicable to certain kinds, right? Not insofar as so what you have in these dimensions, like say number of foxes, number of rabbits, right? That's a predicate or a property of this kind of system. This isn't to say that necessarily nothing other than fox-rabbit systems can have those properties, but certainly not every system can count as having those properties. It demonstrates a kind of intrinsic connection between the kinds of quantitative and qualitative variation individuals can undergo and the kind of individuals they are. Second of all, it indicates a real basis for something like local modality. Right? So what we have here is a localized possibility space. Right? We're only considering certain very limited possible states, which are completely delimited by the dimensions we choose, the variables we've decided to pick out. Now, when dealing with trying to model any system in nature, you're always going to be kind of confronted with this problem of, well, which factors do we include and which factors do we exclude? You know, theoretically, you know, absolutely everything is relevant, you know, in the limit, including like the average class makeup of where you are, because that might mean there are some toffs on horseback coming from foxes, right? But as I kind of mentioned in opposition to the probability example, here, even though you've restricted yourself to certain limited kinds of variation, you haven't thereby restricted yourself to information that is independent of those things you can measure. So put it in these terms, right? There are all sorts of things that the ecosystem, which is supporting this population dynamic between foxes and rabbits, depend upon, right? You know, there's soil, sunlight, and everything you need to, you know, oxygen, everything you need to get the bunny population up and running, right, in order to actually establish this dynamic, right? No information about that has been incorporated here. It's nevertheless been treated as kind of a contextual background for grasping the dynamics that emerge within it. And this is essentially comparable to the role of sort of more varied modal operators in qualifying strict and counterfactual conditions in causal explanation. So if we were going to start talking about the actual kind of causal relations involved within this system and trying to explain the underlying dynamics here, we'd be doing a very similar thing in terms of discounting various different defeasors that could make our counterfactual conditionals not work, right? That's nowhere near as precise as I would like it to be, but you can sort of see the connection here. We have a notion of sort of local modality in which actually we are capturing modal structure. We are capturing the sort of causal structure of things that are occurring within a certain local context, even though we're not necessarily distinguishing all of the potential factors that are involved in that. Okay. Thirdly, pre-individuality. This is kind of most evident in the fox-rabbit example, because precisely the two variables we're dealing with are numbers of individuals. We're dealing with quantities of individuals, foxes and rabbits. However, what's interesting about this is that we're not dealing with specific individuals, right? This is meant to capture the dynamics governing fox-rabbit systems at various different times. You know, so like, you know, you think about it as capturing the dynamics of the system at this time with these particular rabbits and these particular foxes, right? Fair enough. It's also meant to capture whatever could happen in the future, regardless of which particular rabbits and foxes turn up, right? These are not it's not describing relationships between actually fully individuated individuals, but between potential individuals. Um, Moreover, it's actually describing the dynamics of the process through which future individuals will be individuated. So what we have here is something like a description of a process of production, not merely a product. So if we go back to those kind of oppositions between those different oppositions that we took to define sort of classical accounts of substance, what we have here is a certain undermining of the opposition between process and product, or at least the potential to do so. Similarly, you can think of this as also allowing an undermining of the distinction between events and bodies, or at least the prioritization of bodies over events. In that was also part of that. A crucial way. I mean, this is harder to think about from the fox rabbit example because we only have one attractor. But assume, for instance, that there might be, which is entirely possible, for instance, right? You might have some kind of population system in which you've got two attractors, right? You've got two different sort of stable dynamics that the system could be in, right? So if you start here, the system will end up with just fairly small numbers that it'll constantly move through, right? You start over here, there's a much larger set of numbers at which you can have a kind of stable dynamic. I've arbitrarily invented that, but these things do happen, right? What about the transition between those two states? Well, what you have there within that transition is a characteristic kind of event that can occur to such systems. Any sort of individual system that is characterized by this kind of space, right? That is something that can happen to it. A particular kind of affection it can undergo, shifting from one state to another. So what you have is, in a certain sense, a kind of event, a virtual event that can be actualized implicit within the system. Anyway, I've gone on for way too long again, so let's leave it at that for abstract universals, and let's move to concrete universals. So, what I've already said is these spaces, they have no time dimension. That's the crucial thing about them, right? They can potentially have spatial dimensions, but they don't need to, as demonstrated by the fox rabbit example, right? However, this leaves you with a situation in which you can have multiple points running around the same space representing the actual individuals, or the individuals being actualized in various different states. A concrete universal would be such a space that completely individuated the different individuals whose information is encoded, right? What do you need to move from the abstract to the concrete universal? What you need is spatial information, right? You need to, again, like if this is comparable to like the real property underlying a sortal predicate, right? Then if we're being Kantians, well, in order to completely individuate two things that fall into that same predicate, what we need is different locations, right? But of course, because this is already a space, it's already understood in terms of dimensions. Adding extensive spatial dimensions to it is no conceptual problem. It's a bit hard to get your head around, but imagine this two-dimensional space add to it sort of your favorite 3 Euclidean spatial dimensions, right? And what happens in that case is that the individual points that we were previously looking about, like separately dotting about the virtual surface, individual points embedded on this two-dimensional surface, would become 3-dimensional surfaces embedded on a 5-dimensional virtual surface, right? And then what you would see is the way in which that actual surface traversed the virtual space, right, would be the way in which the actual state of the world changed over time, but no longer concerned with an individual system, just a point, but concerned with the state of all systems that fall under this particular universal within the world. I admit this is kind of a bit hard to get your head around, but this is the sort of ultimate payoff of the Deleuzian transition away from Platonism. No longer thinking about universals as individuals, but thinking about them as conditions of individuation, enables you to think about the idea, the universal idea, as the actual set of dimensions that encodes, that can encode the relevant information about the way in which those kinds of systems tend to behave, and how they actually behave, how those virtual tendencies become actualized, not simply in virtue of the information encoded in the idea, because, as we kind of demonstrated here, there is stuff the idea doesn't encode. Right? It's a kind of locality which doesn't take into account like additional external shocks, like the additional factors about what the systems are constituted out of on their environment. It doesn't necessarily distinctly encode all this stuff, but nevertheless it does provide what you might want to think of as a certain kind of perspective upon the actual world as a whole. In that sense, it's a bit like, if any of you know Spinoza, it's a bit like what Spinoza calls the attributes. The attributes as different perspectives on a single substance. There are some sort of additional consequences of this. I suppose the 3 I should mention are, first of all, this means that, so one of the one of the tricky things that's turned up in thinking about modality is thinking about the difference between the modal features of a particular kind of thing in general and the modal features that are intrinsic to an individual qua individual. And this is made kind of more concrete from the dynamic systems perspective way of thinking about things, because the question is, well, when I'm looking at this diagram, am I looking at a phase space diagram which is meant to describe this kind of population dynamic in general, or am I looking at a phase space diagram which just describes this particular system? Does it describe a class of systems, or does it describe just a system? Right? And what you get from this perspective is that
Sorry, yeah, no, I was maybe going to ask something along that lines. I mean, like, for instance, if you're using this sort of structure in order to sort individuals, right? Or not sort individuals, but sort relations between individuals, such as foxes and rabbits and that sort of thing, as a sort of universal structure. Well, what if the same structure applied not to foxes and rabbits at all, but I don't know, like not even things of population, but like, for instance,
you're thinking along the Landian universal idea of
I mean,
abstract mathematical patterns that appear in completely different.
Yeah, like I guess for like if you had availabilities of Coke and like shopping habits of American consumers or something like that, then do they fall under the same sort of, if you're kind of making this the sort of definition of the sort of universal category, then would they be part of the same category or the same sort of sortal?
I don't think so, because fundamentally what distinguishes them is the qualitative and quantitative dimensions that compose them. And so fundamentally, what we've got here is number of foxes, number of rabbits, right? It might look like a pattern that you see in, Coke shoppers and dealers or whatever, or like, you might be able to compare it to something in the war on drugs, like police and drug dealers, right? But fundamentally, those are different dimensions. The attractors or the singularities, right? That's another matter, right? The topological invariants in spaces can have parallel structure, and you can see them popping up all over the place. But the actual virtual surfaces are distinguished by the dimensions that they share, or that draw them. The thing I was going to say is that the way of thinking about the relationship between like the abstract universal, the concrete universal, and what you might want to think of as like the individual idea. Right? So if there's an individual idea corresponding to me, right, or an individual idea corresponding to a particular fox-rabbit system, right, that is a region of the universal idea, right? If you think of, well, what turns the abstract universal and the concrete universal is this addition of spatial dimensions, then you can talk about regions of that space. So it enables you to think how actually this gives you one and the same model to some extent. I mean, it needs a hell of a lot of finessing, but it's a completely different conceptual shift it's a conceptual shift away from the sort of classical model of universals and how you think about it. So okay, regions as individual ideas, that's number one. Two, when I say you add spatial information to the abstract universal to get the concrete universal, you add spatial dimensions. I don't mean that there is one space that can be added to all. Crucially, you get. Is someone trying to say something?
We're trying to get Josh off it. Sorry.
Okay.
Listening now.
Okay.
Good?
What was I saying? Yeah, differences. Sorry, differences in spatial. So, here's a really silly example, right? And all I can give you is silly examples because actually trying to think about different forms of space is really hard. But if we think about house fires, right? A house fire is a kind of process, right? You could model it in these terms in principle, right? What sort of space would you add to that abstract model of various different qualities in order to individuate different house fires, right? Like, or rather, how would those house fires be understood as kind of composing parts of that space, right? Insofar as, you know, the spatial dimensions are both added to the virtual surface, but also to the actual point to turn it into a surface that traverses that virtual surface, right? So on the one hand, you're talking about how is it going to embed in the virtual surface, but also, well, what features of the space are going to be it on the actual surface? That sounds a bit weird, but just follow me. When it comes to representing systems like this that you've been representing as points, you want a space which isn't going to turn the system into anything other than a point, right? Because the system as a whole has the property of having a number of foxes and a number of rabbits, right? If that system was turned into a region, that wouldn't make any sense. The different points within that region wouldn't have global numbers of foxes and rabbits necessarily, right? Here you start seeing how the appropriateness of certain kinds of property or predicate, right, or qualities or quantities, is actually tied up with certain sorts of spaces, right? So again, like this is horribly abstract, but get back to the house fire example, right? This means that the kind of space that you'd want within this case would be something in which, like, imagine like a map of houses on a street, in which basically you can't occupy half of a house. Either you're in the house or you're not. Right? The house as a whole is a location, right? An indivisible location. It's not, doesn't have parts or anything like this, right? That's the kind of space that would be involved in adding spatial dimensions to your house fire abstract universal in order to capture all of the information about which houses are on fire within a given city, or, you know, across the entire universe, right? While still maintaining retaining the information about the actual dynamics of those fires, the ways in which the various different properties are interacting. Okay.
So you're saying the description of what type of space you're talking about is fundamentally tied in with the system in a way sort of external to the system that you have to take into account when laying out this sort of category.
What you end up with is a situation in which sort of There's a sense in which Deleuze sides with Leibniz and a sense in which Deleuze sides with Kant. The sense in which he sides with Leibniz is that there isn't there isn't an obvious single absolute space. There's a plurality of spaces, a plurality of forms of space whose features are fundamentally tied to the kinds of things that are in them. Right? And this sort of it sounds much weirder on a smaller scale. But when you get into like cosmology, it makes obvious sense insofar as, well, look, in in Einsteinian relativity, when you're dealing with like things on the astronomical scale, the space and its structure are very much dependent upon the things that are in it. I might say something else about this in a short while, but I don't have much time left anyway. So,
I have a question.
Yeah?
If you can take it. Not to speak poorly upon current cybernetic research or anything, but I think in a sense, system theory and complexity theory, cybernetics, and this model of rabbits and foxes, seems like a standard, negative dichotomic model. The introduction of the attractor or the systems theory. I guess I wanted to ask if you think that systems theory left post-war cybernetics with.
Chris, it's very hard to understand what you're saying. Why don't you turn your video off, because I think you guys' internet is a little bit slow today. Just turn your video off and try to articulate the question again.
Okay, I'll do my best. Let's see here. Oh, here. I have. Here's another thing. Okay.
It might get better this way.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Maybe you just write it down.
Okay, yeah. I'll repeat continue, and I'll write it in the classroom afterwards.
Yeah, unfortunately, it didn't get better.
Okay. Right. I'll carry on. And then
also, Peter, I just want to say that we're 10 minutes over the class time, so I think people should be aware of that. And also, maybe we should leave. Also, just remember that maybe the coursework and the assignment needs to get discussed at some point before we finish, right? So just like a footnote, but I'm passing it on to you.
Okay, I've got just a couple points left. So I've introduced this idea of the concrete universal, and it's quite mind-bending, but you can sort of see why it's an advancement on the classical theory of universals, because in a certain sense it just introduces more interesting problems. Right? There are loads of problems of how you think about this theory, but at least they're new problems that can be worked through. The thing I said about Leibniz was, he sides with Leibniz because you get this plurality of spaces. When he sides with Kant insofar as you nevertheless have a kind of single time. And this is just basically, I've said that the time dimension has been removed from all of these. In order to get the virtual, you need to take away the time dimension. But that means that in an important sense, the time of each multiplicity is the same, because the time is just the coiled up trajectory on the virtual surface. There's a single time for all the different ideas. Right. One other thing I wanted to say was, with this example of the house fires, I was trying to sort of say, there's got to be an important sense where, if you're just trying to think of the system in terms of the properties it has, just qua individual, like overall properties. You have to think of it as a point, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not feasible to think of systems as regions of space, and regions of space that curve through various dimensions in differentiated ways. Right? It makes perfect sense to think of, say, like, to give a really abstract example, you can think of a sphere, just like it has just the surface of a sphere, as being embedded in like color space, and you could think of that its surface as curving through the various different dimensions of like hue and saturation, and what that would do is just represent the fact that you've got a sphere that's colored in various different ways across the surface, right? It's got various different qualities that aren't reducible to overall qualities, like saying, oh, it's just monochromatically red or monochromatically blue. It's got, the information's much more complex, right? Try and apply that to the house fire example, and if you were capable of thinking of the house fires as regions of space, I mean, the kinds of quality you'd then be thinking about, you know, specific temperatures and this, that, and the other would be different, right? Different space means you need to have a kind of slightly different qualitative manifold. But in moving from thinking about it as a point to thinking about it as a region, you've overcome the other aspect of substance philosophy we were talking about, which is the opposition between thing and stuff. You can just think of the fire as a system, as like this kind of unitary individual, which is to think of it as a point. But you could equally think of it as a region that can be split and change and develop, in which case you're thinking about a stuff that is interestingly differentiated in terms of its qualities and quantities. Right, so that's another way in which the kind of pre-individuality of Deleuze's account of the virtual sort of breaks with the standard kind of ways in which substances have been thought about. Thinking about systems as individual systems doesn't preclude this thought of processes of production, events, or stuffs. Right. Okay. Final things arising, right? And then we'll just talk technical details. Although this, I've kind of shown how roughly there's some interesting stuff regarding pre-individuality here, and that has to relate to what I was talking about in terms of local individuation. And I've said something about local modality here. This needs to be this connection needs to be developed further. We need to see how different sorts of spaces of possibility, different sorts of extensive spaces, various different qualities and quantities and whatnot that go into these are related to the sorts of individuals that emerge within them. How this presents a kind of local perspective on individuals and their causal features, right? And two, I think that the crucial thing is, although we now have this conception of various different ideas encoding the same information but from different perspectives, we need to have some kind of general conception of how it is that these ideas are glued together, how it is that we actually get a single informational continuum out of these various different spaces. And crucially, problems regarding emergence are going to come in here, insofar as, I mean, we already said, like, if you move from the perspective of the stuff of fire to the individual system, the qualitative and quantitative dimensions you're looking at are going to change. They're going to become more complicated, right? that's going to happen at kind of every level of reality. You're going to have to think about, well, how is it that the particular virtual surfaces encoding information about this substrata are connected to the virtual surfaces encoding information about the things that are constituted at the strata above. So this opens a whole messy nest of problems, but they're interesting problems, if albeit difficult ones, and then they're new ones. So, but it does connect all of these issues regarding individuality and modality that we've been discussing. Okay, I'll leave it at that. Sorry for going way over time, guys, but let's talk assignments and just do questions. So the basic plan for the assignments should be on the syllabus. The idea is to submit a 2,500 word essay on a topic agreed with me in advance. So I'm really open to what you want to work on, to be honest. But we do need to have a bit of back and forth about it. So if you can just email me within the next week, preferably, because the deadline for assignments should be in about 2 weeks. Though, again, there can be some wiggle room if you have issues. We can work that out via email. You don't have to write about any of the ideas I've been endorsing here, but you should be talking about metaphysics, and you should be saying something about the methodology through which you approach the relevant questions. Even if you want to tackle the thought of a particular thinker rather than tackling a particular question abstractly. Does anybody have any questions about that?
I guess Peter, it would be great if we can also post this up on the classroom. Just if you're saying anything that's not already in the syllabus about the assignment, we can maybe post it on the classroom.
Yep. No problem. I haven't said much, but I'll put up an announcement and just basically say email me. All is to be negotiated. Okay.
Can I write about the dynamic tendencies of philosophers to talk about metaphysics versus moving back to epistemology?
Maybe, yeah. Epistemology and metaphysics, all good. If you want to throw in systems diagrams, I'm open. I know, again, we've exhausted all of our time, but if people have questions or want to kind of raise things, it's all good. Okay, Reed's got a question.
I don't know how well I'm going to be able to articulate this, but
I don't know how well I articulated that, so.
No, you were great. I always come at this through Hegel, so and we were talking in the second session about the similarities and differences between Hegel and Deleuze. So I just wanted to kind of throw a thought on that line based on what you were just presenting, which is, I wonder if there's, so Hegel is obviously working with a propositional conception of universals in a pretty traditional sense. and in a sense that Deleuze is very explicitly trying to break with. Now, I wonder. The way I think one of the things that Hegel tries to distinguish his conception of the universal from the prior tradition is he tries to conceive of it not necessarily in terms of the distinct content of particular propositions, but the movement of transition that propositions have to go through in their inferential and incompatibility relationships, right? So the way I think about one way of trying to make sense of the relationship there, if you're not going to just take like a strictly anti-Hegelian perspective, which I don't think is actually very helpful, and I think it's kind of unfortunate that Deleuze came about in the climate he did, there's a sense in which I think Hegel is trying to make the proposition do the work of mapping the kind of sub-representational space that Deleuze is using the resources of graphing to make more explicit. So Hegel can't make it as explicit as he would want to because he's using kind of an inferior set of tools. But he nonetheless, I think he thinks that the way the concept moves in its dialectical transitions, nonetheless, is kind of tracing. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I mean, whether it can possibly make sense in the sense of whether it can actually work is another matter.
Yeah.
I can see. I think there's two issues really, insofar as I think. Okay, so two things you might want to kind of take out of the Hegelian account of concepts, at least as reconstructed a bit. One would be the attempt to articulate the content of concepts in terms of incompatibility. If we take Brandom's account. The other would be the account of conceptual revision that's built upon the idea of incompatibility as sort of the essential feature of semantic content. I think one of the interesting things about Brandom's reconstruction of Hegel in the former terms is precisely that although he gets so much out of incompatibility, like you can get the kind of Aristotelian hierarchies of genus and species because you can get exclusive difference versus inclusive difference, right? It does show that you can only get so much, right? You can't, even if you can get some sort of account of sort of more complex counterfactual dependencies in terms of like non-monotonic inferences understood in terms of limited sets of incompatibilities or something like this, right? What you can't get out of it is continuous variation. Like there are certain kinds of information it just cannot encode.
Right.
I think that roughly corresponds to Deleuze's worry about like the negative in the concept versus the positive in the idea. There's just like the concept can always sort of track the information up to a limited point, but there's just certain kinds of information it can't encode. I think. I mean, I'm willing to debate that a bit more, but I suspect that's the kind of the first kind of problem. Right. The second thing to do with conceptual change, I mean, that's where I'm really sympathetic to Hegel, insofar as, I mean, like the things I was trying to say earlier about the issue of how we go about the question of what real properties are. I think fundamentally is sort of guided by the issue of conceptual revision, right? It's those things that those properties that we have to kind of continually revise our accounts of, right? That are worth distinguishing as real properties, right? If we weren't in a position to be forced to revise our concepts of these things, there'd be an important sense in which we weren't dealing with real properties. And that's why I think that things like conjunctive and disjunctive properties just aren't, like, you've got predicates, but you don't have properties in any interesting sense. So I think there's something there with Hegel in the account of conceptual revision, and I think you might even be able to get something interesting out of it regarding his concept of essence. But the problem is Hegel makes the concept itself the kind of metaphysical ground of, he takes this interesting account of conceptual revision and then makes it into a metaphysics rather than using it as the sort of epistemological entry point into a metaphysical inquiry. I need to kind of again go through Hegel more to explain exactly. You did a good job of that a couple of weeks ago, but I think, I just think he. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have any other questions from people? Okay. Okay. So from Svetlana, her question is, what does thinking this reads in terms of processes instead of this is read entail? And this is reference to Ray Brassier. So for Ray, this will sort of come through Sellers and Sellers' process philosophy, which I must admit I don't entirely understand. Right, Sellers' process philosophy is hard, and I find it particularly hard because I just don't understand the motivations of it. Like, Sellers' motivation for process philosophy comes from his account of perception and his issue with censor, and with the idea that there's just something irreducible about the pinkness of the ice cube, as Mo is referencing in the comments. I just think most of the arguments motivating the need for a philosophy of pure process from Sellers' perspective are just bad. That being said, that doesn't mean there's nothing to it. I mean, there's certainly something to be said about trying to rethink the relationship between individuals and events that it puts forward. So in the first session, I said how although we can talk about objects of thought in a fairly abstract way, and even talk about the objects of thought the objects of empirical discourse. Empirical discourse seems to talk about both sort of bodies, right, and events, and stuffs and things, and processes and products. Why should we take that to be this sort of prioritization of substantive things that are then understood to have accidents? Why shouldn't we think of the apple as reading rather than being read? I think there's there's potentially mileage in that. And in fact, I mean, if you follow Deleuze, like Deleuze, I don't know if you ever come across the logic of sense. This is precisely what he proposes there. So he will talk about how, as far as he's concerned, like the verb is sort of semantically primary. And this is because verbs correspond to these ideal events, which is to say they correspond to these sort of topological features of the virtual surfaces that describe the tendencies of actual constituted individuals. Very difficult book, but this is sort of precisely what he's proposing. He's sort of saying when we say this is red, there's always a sense in which actually really what we're talking about is an occurrence of redding, a sort of it's always sort of implicitly processual. It's just that within a certain context we've come to think about it as, again, just as we come to think about like individual systems as products rather than processes, we end up thinking of their accidents as sort of constant states rather than events.
Yeah, because the redding of something, like, it depends upon, like, I mean, you could look at a white tie under a red light and it would look red, but I mean, whether or not it's red or white depends upon the sort of contextual conditions under which one is viewing it. So the whole...
Well, that also depends upon like what you mean, what you think color refers to. I mean, color is such a classical example in philosophy, and there's so much literature on it. And there's, you know, the fundamental thing always comes down to, well, are you talking about like a disposition of things, right? Something like a chemical property, right? That disposes them to emit certain wavelengths of light, right, under certain conditions, right? Or are you talking about the way in which we interpret them, the way in which they're processed through our brains under certain conditions, right? And the conditions in each case are going to be interpreted slightly differently because of the way in which you're articulating.
So the process here, right? The process here relates to maybe how these three things interrelate. So from one hand, the chemical property, the light, and sense perception, and how these three sort of like are constantly in a sort of like a process.
I mean, yeah, but I mean, jumping straight to interrelation might disguise the possibility of pulling apart the conceptual components. So, for instance, I see no reason why you can't sort of develop one conceptual system for talking about, you know, pigment, right? Which we like. This is the thing, like pigment. We have really detailed ways of describing it. Like really, like we are better at describing pigments than we are at detecting them with our eyes. Like, you know, Pantone and Adobe Photoshop, and you know, we have this whole kind of elaborate system for distinguishing color from the standpoint of kind of the generation of light. But on the other hand, there is, I mean, taking the kind of horrible example of the dress recently, there is definitely a sense in which you can describe experienced color in ways that don't line, although they're perhaps in some way based upon, you know, pigment. They shift away from them. They don't correspond properly. And one of the issues is if you want to actually get an account of of experienced colour as a thing in itself, you actually need the contrast of the account of pigment. So, I mean, just to give you a really crude example, like you should all have seen at some point the kind of weird optical illusions you get, not like the dress, but where you're shown something like a leaf, and you look at it, and it's green, it's a dark green, right? But then if you're shown isolated portions of the leaf, like you blow up different parts of it, you go, oh crap, they are completely different pigments. Like the way in which you perceive the colour of the thing overall is kind of like relational in terms of how you see it in various different shades of light and your understanding of the kind of object it is, this, that, and the other. But actually, in order for that fact about experienced colour to actually be presented, you need some account of of pigment to contrast it with. So you don't want to kind of make everything too relational too quickly, lest you not actually see the relations. It's a sort of sidebar there,
So what would be a good model? So instead of like the myth of the given, right, which is like one directional, things coming from the world into consciousness, or the correlational model of like things going between the two to constitute them, right? You have this two forces or two things pressing against a membrane on one side coming from the observer, which kind of like includes that type of like comparison with other pigments that you have in mind and all that, pressing against the light and the chemical component or atomic component of the pigment, pressing against the membrane of whatever you want to call it, of, I don't know, cognition, perception, cognoperceptive membrane. So and then they co-constitute it. So that is sort of like a way of sort of like moving away from the given, right? Now, I'm not trying to say which one has more of a force in constituting, but these two are pressing against. I don't know. I'm just like...
I just think constituting is the wrong way of thinking about it.
Yes, that's probably like a wrong verb. It just came to my mouth. So please correct me.
Well, the issue I'd say is like it's more like you're looking at two different kinds of disposition, right? Would be the way I'd prefer to think about it, right? You're looking at sort of two different sorts of disposition, which we initially think to overlap, and which then we come to distinguish, because the first, so see, our perceptual mechanisms, right, are kind of roughly calibrated to get a grip on the first sort of disposition. Call it pigment, right? The disposition to emit certain kinds of wavelengths of light, right, under certain conditions, right? But what we find actually is that things have more complicated dispositions to cause certain states within us, within our perceptual mechanisms, right, that pull apart from simply the production of states which cause us to distinguish certain kinds of pigmentary dispositions. Things, I mean, yeah, I need to think about it more. It's a really I mean, color, despite it being the go-to example every time, is just way more complicated than you ever intended to be. But my sort of desiderata is we should always be talking about sort of causal affection when it comes to our sensory systems. So what we end up with is distinguishing from complex causal interactions two different sorts of causal causal patterns, one which is independent of us and one which is fundamentally dependent on us, or independent upon us as a certain kind of causal system. Yeah. As for, just to finish off the response to the original question, I think I am really sympathetic to the idea of reinterpreting everything in event and process terms, and seeing non-event, non-process terms as kind of derivative.
Thank you.
Great.
One more question, please.
Okay, go ahead, Igor.
Thank you. Maybe I don't understand something, but my question is, what is distraction? What is this? I mean, if we deal with Latour's, Delanda's, or Whitehead's philosophy, everything is okay. There is no distraction. It is just a change. Maybe. I mean, object can be distracted. Distraction is not exist. It's just a huge change. But if we deal with object-oriented philosophy, I remember that Hamann insisted that distraction is exist. But I'm not satisfied with his answer. Can you tell me something about that?
I mean, I suppose I agree with Hamann that there is such a thing as destruction, right? So the idea of things ceasing to exist. Yeah, I think you have to allow for destruction. The question is just how you conceive it. I mean, in the most general. One of the things that I like about Deleuze's metaphysics, and it isn't something I've gone into, but it's something that might connect up with Svetlana's question, is information lost? Right? Is there an objective loss of information in the world? I think Deleuze thinks there is. He also thinks there's a creation of information. Right? He thinks that new information is created and all information is lost, which goes against certain views regarding the conservation of information in physics. But I think that it's an interesting and workable position, and that implies like not just a kind of a sort of casual sense of destruction, but like a very sort of substantial sense of destruction, which sometimes things cease to be, and we can't even recover the information of what they were from the way things are now.
This is a problem for me because, on the one hand, I agree with Hamann in his thesis, but I don't. His arguments is not enough for me. I want something more.
I don't think any of his arguments are good at all. So I wouldn't stand any of my agreements on Hamann's arguments. I just think that it's fairly obvious that things do cease to be. Okay. well, I'll take some questions from Svetlana, and then we should probably close. So, first of all, her first question is, who or what actualizes the actual informational surface in Deleuze? So, my idea is it's got nothing to do with us, except for the fact that we are part of the universe, right? So the best way to articulate this is to go back to what I talked about in terms of Spinoza last week. So the Spinozan idea is, look, there is an excess of potentiality over actuality, right? There are more capacities than are ever actualized, more tendencies than are ever actualized, right? But nevertheless, there is only ever one and one actual world. The world could only ever be one way. I'm committed to this. Deleuze is committed to it. How do you reconcile those two things? The idea is that sort of locally, there are different ways things could be. Locally, there are virtual tendencies that aim in certain ways, but they could be potentially disrupted by interactions with context or things that are not taken into account. There, sorry, my Java is coming. But globally, once you take everything into account, only one trajectory is created, right? And although we can talk about that trajectory from the perspective of the whole isn't a trajectory in the sense of a single line, but it's going to be an actual informational surface that curves through various other dimensions as the information it encodes changes. And this is not metaphorical, but it's also not quite fully worked out. But the idea is roughly the state, the information state of the world as it is now, the way it actualizes the various different virtual sort of capacities and tendencies of its various different components, determines precisely the way it's going to be in the future. It's got nothing to do with the way we interpret it or not. So what you end up with is a sort of actual surface that just imminently curves and changes as it sort of draws a trajectory across the virtual. I hope that makes some kind of sense. The second thing that you ask is, are the so-called laws of physics those singular attractors? And the answer to that is sort of yes and no. And what I was trying to discuss last week is the sense in which the kind of modal strength that we ascribe to different sorts of causal regularities varies, and what physics goes for are really strongly invariant counterfactual claims. However, we get various different strengths and various different local situations, dependent upon the sorts of individuals, the sorts of properties that bear them within those kind of local actual spaces. So what I want to say is there are what you might want to call laws in the special sciences. There are laws in in biology and maybe in economics even. But as long as we don't ask too much of laws, as long as we don't ask that all laws be the laws of physics, then I'm happy to say that what we're doing in formulating those laws is essentially trying to capture the singularities in the relevant kind of virtual surfaces. But as I say, those surfaces themselves have a certain kind of locality and a certain sort of excluding of factors that potentially might be relevant to determining whether or not the regularities continue or go through. The question is whether or not, for physical laws, what we end up with is just more of the same, like working our way up from sort of like everyday folk regularities through developing more interesting biological science and finding certain kinds of regularities and whatnot and encoding them as law, whether or not in doing kind of fundamental physics we're working our way up to more and more invariant principles. And the question is whether or not we hit something like a ceiling of invariance. We hit like absolute, what I call absolutely monotonic inference, rather than just finding sort of more pools of stability. I'm not sure. I mean, people like Meyasu obviously would want to say no. Even someone like Lee Smolin would want to say, well, no, actually the laws of physics vary. I'm tempted by the idea that it makes no sense to say that all laws vary unless there is some law of the variation of laws. But how to conceive of that kind of ultimate invariant structure, of like ultimate invariant mobile structure of reality upon which all of this other stuff rests, is something I'm still working on. I hope that makes some kind of sense. Right, we should probably call it there.
Yes, we're officially 1 hour over.
I'm really sorry, Mo. You've been an absolute
No,
star.
it's great. People enjoyed it, and it will enrich the video archives for later auditors and members who will go over this later. Don't ask me. I will call it historic, but it's just like my mouth is just like, some people say you're like, I don't know. But this is like all historic to me. So all this is good. It's just going to get saved in the archives.
Okay, guys. Thank you very much. I'll post about procedures for essays on the course page. Thank you for having me.
I also was talking to Chris on the message, and he has a question that he was just basically running to do something, organizing a workshop somewhere. He's in France with everybody doing the path thing.
Oh, half,
but,
isn't he?
but he said he's going to post it to the classroom.
Okay, great.
So let's keep in touch in the classroom page, and be good with your assignments. And yeah, and talk to you guys soon. And thanks again for this another awesome Peter Wolfendale seminar.
Great. Catch you guys.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Yes, you're welcome. Bye-bye. Bye. 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 Bye.